Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Today's talk from wherever you are. We're so glad you could join us. My name is Lara Smith. I'm the director of the African Studies program here at Georgetown, and I'm associate professor in the School of Foreign Service in the Department of Government. I'm happy to welcome you to today's event, which is called Keep Eyes on Sudan, Higher Education in Times of Conflict. It's part of a series that's hosted by Georgetown's African Studies program, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the Georgetown Conflict Resolution Program, Gender Plus Justice Initiative, and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. This event, we're excited, is also co-sponsored by the African Studies Association and the Middle East Studies Association Global Academy. This event features a discussion of a recent Rift Valley Institute report by Muna Elgadal and Rebecca Glade. It's called Research in Displacement, the Impact of War on Sudan's Higher Education and Academic Research Community. And it assesses the damage of higher education in Sudan and mass displacement of Sudan's students and faculty. It also highlights the experience of Sudanese academics and students who've been displaced as they continue to work and attempt to rebuild their lives. A link to the report can be found in the chat. Today, we're able to feature one of the authors, Rebecca Glade. We're really delighted and grateful that she's come. She's also a Georgetown and School of Foreign Service alum and a former student of mine, so really happy to have her. Rebecca received her PhD in African history at Columbia University, where she wrote her dissertation, which is entitled Sudanese Political Movements and the Struggle for the State, 1964 to 1985. She's published on the history of the student movement at the University of Khartoum in Africa, and she's currently a visiting researcher at Makerere University in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies, and she's the managing editor of the Makerere Historical Journal. This event is moderated also by a friend and colleague, Elgadal, who's an affiliate with Georgetown's African Studies program and the Institute for the Study of International Migration. Elgadal is currently working with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as a senior advisor on the human rights of migrant workers with a focus on the GCC countries. He served as a representative of OHCHR for Yemen and a founding head of the UN Human Rights Training and Documentation Center for Southwest Asia and the Arab region from 2011 to 2017. Thank you, Professor Elgadal, for being with us as well. Following several rounds of questions with our speakers, following the presentation, we'll have several rounds of questions with our speakers, and we'll have question and answers with the audience. If you'd like to submit a question throughout, you can use the Zoom Q&A feature, which should be on your screen. You can also email questions to my colleague Coco Tate at ct885@georgetown.edu. This information will also be found in the chat. So I now hand it over to you, Elgadal, and thank you both.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Elgadal Ahmed Elgadal, and Lara, I'm really sorry I didn't update my bio at Georgetown. I left the UN last year, and I'm currently working as a consultant, and I'm also teaching human rights and migration at Georgetown. I don't know if you chose me, Lara, because of my background, but this is quite a coincidence, because not only am I a product of the Sudanese public education, I'm also a graduate of University of Khartoum in '86. So this cuts deep, actually, and reading the report brings a lot of things home. Rebecca, I currently have two nieces. I'm trying to find places for them to take exams, and we actually couldn't. So this is very timely and extremely important, and I'm really grateful to African Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, and the rest of the outfits of Georgetown to shed lights on this, because we currently, most of us are bemoaning the fact that actually Sudan is kind of forgotten. And on top of that, I think the plight of a lot of students have been forgotten. So I thank you and Elgadal for this timely report, and I'm really looking forward to the contribution. So I'll turn it to you, Rebecca, and very grateful for the report and for being with you guys. Rebecca?
Thank you very much, Professor Glade. I'm really happy to be here, and I have a PowerPoint, so I'm gonna bear with me as I share screen for it. Aha, it worked. Okay. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And I mean, Professor Glade, your experiences and your comments is part of the reason that we sort of came to this topic. Both me and my co-author, Muna, were living and teaching in Khartoum when the war broke out. And for us, I mean, one of the first things I began thinking about initially was the question of university records. And I was working on that. And it became clear that there was a systematic problem, and like that the issues went so much deeper than any one issue. I mean, that it was really about the whole system. And I was really grateful and lucky when the Rift Valley Institute began speaking with me about the possibility of doing this report and thinking about doing this research and thinking about the sort of system of higher education. In many ways, it goes beyond just questions of sort of knowledge production, although the lack of universities affects knowledge production, of course, but it really links into questions long-term for the country about public education, about the role of professionals, about opportunities for young people, both during this war, but also after, and in terms of questions of rebuilding. And, you know, in that sense, like we really sort of, I mean, it becomes very critical now. Yes, I can, sorry, I'm adjusting to technology still. I mean, so I'm going to go over and give a sort of overview of the paper itself and what I'll be talking about. As caveat here that this, I mean, it's a pretty long paper. There are details that I won't be able to get into in the time of this presentation, but you know, because the issues are somewhat systemic, and my goal is to get the sort of broad overview of the structures involved and the big challenges involved, and tailor a little bit to questions of solidarity and possibilities for those in higher education in America for ways to support higher ed and Sudanese academics and students from abroad. So I'll start by going and thinking about taking you through some background on Sudanese higher education, the institutions of higher education since the war, the movement decisions of Sudanese academics and students as they've been displaced, and the state of academics and students and the opportunities and lacks thereof in different locations, as well as some recommendations. And I'd like to note here a little bit about our methodology. This was a multi-site research with mixed methods. We did field work, whatever that means on terms of interviews, physically in 4 countries, in Egypt, South Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia, in addition to contacting people and having conversations as well as sort of WhatsApp correspondences with people in the Gulf as well as in Sudan. We also had a survey that we distributed on social media that got about 199 or so responses, which was interesting because the people who were online enough to respond to that were in some ways very different than some of the people we met in different locations. And this was all possible in part because of our sort of positions within Sudanese academia. Muna was a lecturer at Ahliya University, as well as being a PhD student at IMAP in France. And I, at the time, and I was a volunteer lecturer at University of Khartoum in the history department prior to the war. And we were both displaced and sort of were familiar with the networks of where people were going in the country, our respective countries where we ended up, her in Egypt and me in Uganda. So, I mean, this gave us a sort of set of resources for learning about our colleagues and reaching out to colleagues and help facilitate this research in many ways. Now, Sudanese higher education has its origins in the colonial period with the establishment of Gordon Memorial College in 1902, 1903. And it, you know, at the beginning, it was really designed to create the sort of muwazzafin or civil servants of the colonial state. However, it also bred early nationalists and became a site of politics from very early as well. After independence, Gordon Memorial College was elevated to University of Khartoum, and the system of higher education gradually expanded. By the 1970s, the system had elevated a few other universities across the country, I mean, mostly in Khartoum as well. And it was gradually expanding. And from the very beginning, it was a site of politics. I mentioned the sort of early nationalists, the Graduates Congress. It was also the site of resistance and opposition that prompted the October Revolution in 1964. And students participated were leaders in the 1985 Intifada that ousted Nimeri. Indeed, students were also leaders in the 2019 December Revolution that ousted Bashir. So it was understood to be, higher education has been understood to be a site of politics in addition to a site of sort of creation of professionals. After the Ngaz regime took power in 1989, the expansion of higher education happened in pretty intense ways, and this had political justifications, or not so much justifications, but motives in terms of diluting the power and omnipresence of University of Khartoum, as well as fitting into part of a sort of tamkeen program of expansion of capacity, so to speak. And that expansion involved the elevation of secondary schools and universities to universities across the states, as well, and faced certain challenges in terms of quality of education, which were contended with then over the next 20 years. By the time of the outbreak of war, there were at least 39 public universities, 125 or so private universities, and about at least 700,000 students and over 14,000 lecturers, of whom about 8,000 had PhDs. These numbers we got from the Ministry of Higher Education, but they're from 2016. So you can pretty much expect that since then, the number of students at least would expand pretty dramatically, because there was a sort of backup in cohorts, since there were several delays due to the revolution, COVID, the coup, that delayed and made cohorts larger, and there were actually more students enrolled than just the sort of standard 4 to 5 years. So now, if we're thinking about this outbreak of war, this is a story of both disaster and great resilience and people working heroically to preserve and maintain institutions. The physical infrastructure of universities has been devastated, though, and we should be clear at that, especially in Khartoum as well as in Darfur. Physically, the destruction's been profound, and the truth of the matter is we won't understand the full significance of this destruction or how extensive it is until the war ends or until certain areas stop being combat zones. The photo here is a photo of the Mohammed Omar Bashir Center for Sudan Studies at Ahliya University, which was burned pretty much entirely and is a great loss to the country. But we also need to remember that universities are not just physical sites. They are spaces of activity and community, and those have continued despite the war. Education has continued, classes have continued in different capacities, and teaching has continued, and even exams have continued despite real impediments and real inequalities on access and ability to the quality might be compromised, but people have worked very hard to give access to education. So universities are, since the war began, the Ministry of Higher Education relocated and continued its operations, though it's been subject to a military government whose own priorities are very different. They're very much invested in the war itself, and so continuing institutions of higher education are not their priority, and that's reflected in questions that come financially. The ability of universities to get money from the Ministry of Finance for salaries. So universities are operating in different capacities across the country. In the east and in the north, in Gadaref, Kassala, Port Sudan, and in Shimalia, universities are continuing both online and in person, mostly uninterrupted. There are classes being held, there are exams being held. On the other hand, universities in Darfur have almost entirely stopped operations, maybe starting online courses, but in really impossible conditions that make it very difficult. Private and Ahliya universities are Most of them are largely at a standstill. Some that have financial backing and interest relocated to other countries. I'm thinking of the Mamoun Humeda University of Medicine and Science and Technology, which relocated to Rwanda and Tanzania, and others such as Ahfad have prioritized new projects like online master's degrees, but have basically stopped operations for undergraduates. There's a real variety with the private ones. Government universities, eventually, after some confusing moments, were instructed to continue online operations online if they can't in person. And that's varied pretty dramatically depending on the capabilities and ability of a university. I was told by one dean that they were instructed per college that when they could reach and make contact with about 60% of their students, they would resume online courses, which has varied often college by college within a single university, much less across all the universities and the 39 government universities in Sudan. Even within University of Khartoum, which began online operations very early, there was some variety in the speed at which it happened based off of when the deans could make contact with the administration, the personal situations of deans and their ability to the administrative leadership that was possible in those moments. So online teaching has been happening. And online teaching was pioneered then in this situation at University of Khartoum, but it's happening in different ways, often with very different means. So faculty are teaching in different situations. Not all faculty in one department are in one place or in the same circumstances. And their students are often in different circumstances as well. So it's often very mixed. Some are using Google Meets. Some are using to have synchronous lectures. Some are sending their lectures in increments via Telegram or WhatsApp. People will send faculty will send PDFs with these recordings and PowerPoint slides and answer questions via chats. And meanwhile, you have students going and I was talking to one colleague who was telling me that he had students who would wake up at 4 a.m. to go by the Nile at the right spot where they could get internet to download the asynchronous lectures. So these are very challenging situations, and there's a real variety in how people have been teaching. Now, some universities many now have held exams, and they have done. University of Khartoum, at the time I wrote this, had done 2 sets of exams. And they did it through testing sites. The first involved sites in Cairo, Kassala, Atbara, Port Sudan, and in Saudi Arabia. And at the time in Madani, and the second set was after the fall of Madani. And so that was relocated to Kassala for the second set. But it's these set of very particular testing sites, which is a logistical nightmare. The second set of exams they held were exams for students for 2 semesters worth of academic activity. So they're taking 22 exams over the course of 3 weeks, and 2 a day, often having to arrange you have to do this, they had to arrange accommodation in these locations in addition to facilities. This is all quite challenging. This is also another large challenge has been about university records. Servers in Khartoum and in Darfur were completely destroyed, which has meant that often students' records go with it and are where these things are stored. Now, University of Khartoum and all universities have been able to rely on the Ministry of Higher Education's backups, which they had for dates of registration for all students across the country. So they can show and prove who was a registered student and the date that they registered in their first year. However, for questions of degrees, or grades for transcripts, that's not been the case. University of Khartoum had separate servers per college for undergraduates, and they had backups for the graduate transcripts that they were able to get immediately. And they were able to recover something like 80 or 90% of their undergraduate transcripts from backups, but it was a whole process and it was very challenging and a lot of work to do. In Darfur, this was even worse, where most of it was not online and was not electronic to begin with. And also kind of got to the point of honestly almost like heroic levels. A faculty member from a dean from the University of Niala told me about when the war broke out, they took up arms, went to the university, grabbed the servers or hard drives with the student records on them and brought them to a secure location to preserve. And they weren't able to bring them out of Niala because the roads were not safe for electronics to prevent looting. So they've just been sort of in an indeterminate place since then. So, these are real challenges. Similar to the variety in access or preservation of record, there's a variety in terms of access to records. Some private universities like Ahfad and UMST were able to had backup servers outside of Sudan, and so they had preserved their records from very early. Other private universities did not and faced disastrous issues as well. But at the same time, there have been serious issues. Ahfad has not yet released certificates for even students who graduated since the war broke out, despite having these backup servers outside the country. Meanwhile, government universities have made sites to get their documents in Port Sudan, but this process is very slow and very expensive, which has meant that the question of accessing academic transcripts, accessing certificates is a laborious and very difficult one. Meanwhile, faculty who've been doing this heroic teaching are doing so with very limited funds. The Ministry of Finance has released salaries for faculty at 60% of their original salaries before the war. And it's worth noting here that the Sudanese pound has devalued since then. So it's 60% of a devalued salary, which makes clear that our colleagues who are teaching in this system are not doing so for the money. Or at least not the money alone, because it's really work done to care for students and care for those who have been looking up to them before the war. And this is even more dire in Darfur, where the Ministry of Finance informed Darfur universities that they would not release salaries unless there were academic activities held, which has meant that universities this year, which has meant that for one, you do see some online. I know I've met a student who is a current student at Al-Fashir University taking lectures, but one wonders the ability to learn when you have faculty under bombardment trying to teach lectures and students in very different places. Meanwhile, the process is really challenging. Students and faculty are displaced. They face internet outages and electricity outages, and then internet outages caused as a part of this conflict, where certain states have been without internet for months, which means that teaching online classes becomes a real challenge for faculty and students in the affected areas. And the final big disruption, I would say, began with the invasion when the RSF entered Jazeera state in December of last year, which really was quite challenging for this whole process. Following the outbreak of war, the Ministry of Higher Education had relocated many of its activities first to Jazeera, to Madani, as had many universities set up sort of sites in Madani. It was not only a testing site, but sort of a hub for a lot of higher ed activity. So when Jazeera state became a conflict zone, it wasn't just the loss of Madani, Jazeera University. It was also a loss of the logistical and the need to relocate all these logistical things from Madani to Port Sudan, which created a lot of challenges. Now, going from that's the system, and where there's a lot of big challenges and there's a lot of real heroic work going into preserving it. Meanwhile, we have a huge number of displaced Sudanese academics and students. Look, the displacement crisis of Sudan, I don't have the exact updated stats in front of me, but it's really profound and huge. And the scale and speed is pretty unprecedented since the partition of South Asia. So we're talking a huge number. But in addition, this was even more profound for those who worked in higher ed or were existing in higher ed in any way, because universities exist in cities, and this war, unlike most of Sudan's previous wars, is fundamentally an urban war where combat has occurred in cities. And with most universities in Sudan, in Khartoum, and those that are not in Khartoum, in state capitals, the universities, the proximity of lecturers and students to combat is profound. And this has meant that both faculty and students have been deeply affected, not just by displacement, but, you know, they've witnessed horrible violence. They've lost their homes and their families. They've been traumatized. They've been killed in some cases. And they faced the loss of their belongings and their lives in serious ways. So the scale, I mean, and that's the case across the country for many people. But, you know, this is where we're starting at with the decisions that are being made, and the sort of challenges that they face is then affected by that profound reality. Now, the impact for the Sudanese middle class has often involved a very calculated displacement. You know, students face different decisions in that sense from faculty. Faculty have tended to follow opportunities, although female academics have been more likely to prioritize their family's opportunities and and that of their spouse than simply just their own opportunities. But in general, students, on the other hand, have tended to follow their parents or extended families into displacement, whether that be inside of Sudan or outside of Sudan. As a result of this sort of difference in calculus, while the majority of Sudanese are still in Sudan, there's a larger percentage, I would say, of Sudanese academics and lecturers who have left Sudan than students, with many more students are still in Sudan, whereas the proportion of lecturers and academics have tended to be larger that left. Although I would say that, at least based off of the conversations I've had, that number is by no means complete, and I would say a majority are still in Sudan, even for lecturers and academics, at least a few months ago. Now, in neighboring countries, there have been academics and students have faced a number of differing opportunities and challenges that have sort of been affected, and we go through a number of them, and I'll go briefly through it. Which including neighboring countries in Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, and then broad outline of the rest of East Africa and the Gulf. So displacement in Egypt has been, I'd say a very large number of Sudanese academics and students have gone to Egypt, of those displaced outside of Sudan. Many came by legal means at the very first months. The first month after the war, women and men over age, I think 55 or 50, were able to go without a visa. After a month, the Egyptian government essentially closed the border to Sudanese, making it much harder, and some started going over time via irregular means. Egypt is in the middle of a serious crackdown on irregular migration, and Sudanese migration in particular, involving like stops on the street to check papers. They shut down Sudanese schools, which has created, honestly, a large network of challenges for the Sudanese middle class as a whole, including Sudanese academics and students. It's expensive and challenging for Sudanese students to register at Egyptian universities. Prior to the war, the Egyptian government had a policy that gave Sudanese students a 90% discount on university fees in Egypt. However, after the war, the Egyptian government changed the percentage and made it a 60%, I want to say. We have exact numbers in the report, but it became a rapid increase in university fees to study in Egypt, far beyond. And they also have to pay a particular fee to an Egyptian government office to arrange for placement, which creates large barriers at the very beginning, especially at a moment when families don't necessarily have a lot of money for this. In addition, it's very challenging for Sudanese academics and lecturers to find employment in Egyptian institutions of higher education. Part of that is a saturation of existing places and underfunded higher ed there. And part of it is, and then there are other challenges across that. But at the same time, there is a very large Sudanese community with existing social ties in Egypt, which creates a different dynamic than we'll see in some of the other countries in question. Now, in Ethiopia, it's been really challenging. Restrictions on entry has been a real thing. Sudanese seeking to go into Ethiopia face a decision at entry on whether to go as a refugee, at which point they're expected to stay in refugee camps on the borders in pretty bad conditions, or to get a visa and then go directly from Gondar to Addis Ababa, or to fly directly to Addis Ababa. Now, flying or going to Gondar, that whole process is expensive, not just because of the plane tickets, but because visas are extremely expensive. Sudanese get an entry visa and then a visa that can last for up to 6 months upon renewals, but it's $100 a month to renew it. So it's about $600 to keep a visa for 6 months. Then you're expected to leave and come back. During that time, you don't have legal status to enter your kids into school or to really live regularly or to find work. So the whole question, it's functionally difficult to find work as a result as a Sudanese lecturer on these visas. What that has meant is that for the most part, entry to Ethiopia is a transit point where academics and students seek visas for a third country, usually after they've been accepted into a program or been offered something there. This whole process, though, is very challenging or problematic in that despite this being the hub for getting the visas, even after students have been accepted into programs or colleagues have been accepted into residencies of different sorts, the governments involved often will reject the visas anyway without specifying reasons or for concern that they'll seek asylum somewhere, which has meant that people spend large amounts of money getting and staying in Ethiopia waiting for these visas that then they get rejected from. And one person I spoke to talked about selling his laptop so he could go and apply for the visa and then getting rejected. And it's a huge financial burden and a huge issue. It's virtually impossible for students to register as Sudanese students to register as students in Ethiopia. To do so requires a letter from the Sudanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the Sudanese Ministry of Higher Education involved, going to the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who then sends it to the Ministry of Education in this sort of Byzantine process. I've been told that there's another process is a little bit faster if you're living in the camps as a refugee, but honestly, it seems like it's not very feasible. And employment, as I mentioned, is very challenging at this time. That said, there is a real opportunity if there was external funding and coordination and diplomatic efforts between the Sudanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Education, because the Ministry of Education in Ethiopia is extremely centralized, and there is a need for more higher PhD holders. And prior to the war in Tigray, they had been recruiting in India and other locations with World Bank funding. However, with the funds drying up, that stopped being feasible. So there would be a potential for some sort of coordination at the state level, but it would really require high-level efforts as well as support from international bodies to provide funding for something like that. South Sudan, on the other hand, is probably the only place where Sudanese academics have been recruited. And it's a very interesting case in that sense. Movement to South Sudan is extremely difficult at land borders. It's a very harrowing journey. All those I've spoken to describe it as very difficult. And it's also very expensive. You have to fly from Rank to Juba because the infrastructure for going by land is difficult. It's a whole thing. However, University of Juba in particular has been recruiting lecturers. And this can be accounted for and understood as part of a sort of need to build up higher ed since South Sudan gained its independence. When University of Juba moved from Khartoum to where it had been located to Juba, it went from 600 faculty members to 165, I want to say. And it rebuilt by like inviting in South Sudanese academics going back to South Sudan and teaching. But it's a real process, but there was a real need for higher degree holders and especially PhD holders in many programs, especially in STEM. Since the outbreak of war, University of Juba has recruited over 100 faculty, and it took measures to advance salaries or advance fees from paid for plane tickets to help faculty move from Sudan to South Sudan as part of that. Even advancing salaries through their own accounts, not through the Ministry of Finance, knowing that there would be delays in salary payment because this is a persistent issue in South Sudan. There is a pretty open policy allowing for registration of returning South Sudanese students as well as Sudanese students, but the number of students who have registered in South Sudan is pretty low. Part of that is due to a lack of university records. Part of that is they've honored even imperfect records that aren't at the UNESCO standards when students had something. But due to the challenges I described before, many students have ended up in different locations without adequate records to seek registration somewhere. Other challenges include, like I mentioned, the ability of students to get somewhere. Students have tended to follow their families. So if their parents are in one location, they're less likely to go and seek registration somewhere else, without their family. And there are a number of other issues as well. I mean, to compare, like the Ministry of Higher Education paid for full scholarships for about 500 students a year to go and study in Sudan prior to the war, which meant there was a cohort of like 2,000, 2,500 South Sudanese students enrolled in universities in Sudan. And the ministry has planned and committed to continuing their scholarships at University of Juba should they come back. Of the ones who did come back, though, like when I went into the research in February, there had been less than 500 students, Sudanese and South Sudanese alike, who've been able to register in South Sudan. So, even among those scholarship holders, the number who came back were very, very low, relatively speaking, and that's been a real challenge. Other challenges in South Sudan for lecturers has been the cost of accommodation. We're talking really high rents, which has made going to South Sudan really challenging for lecturers who have families specifically. Some lecturers who are hired there sent their families on to Uganda, particularly men, sent their families on to Uganda and live 4 to a room while teaching in pretty challenging and uncomfortable conditions. Others have struggled with this issue. The University of Juba has faculty accommodation for about 100 of their 1,000+ staff. So their ability to help in accommodation questions is extremely limited. And then all of this has gotten worse over this past year. When I did this research, salaries were late by a month or two, but it wasn't anything unusual. By now, like to date, like salaries have not come at all into 2024 for South Sudanese faculty, which has meant that while the university has advanced salaries for North Sudanese faculty, South Sudanese faculty have received no salaries from their universities at all, which creates some bad feelings for sure, as well as creating logistical complications for the university in terms of keeping new recruits. Uganda as a location is unusual compared to the others we discussed because it does not share a land border with Sudan. Everyone who comes has to come as a result either through South Sudan or via plane directly from Sudan. So the cost involved to get there is quite high. Now, there is a large community, however. There are challenges for students in the mid-levels enrolled at university due to recognition of issues and lengths of secondary school in Uganda, which does secondary school for 12 years versus the 11 years in Sudan. There's also challenges for lecturers to find employment because government universities have a hiring freeze as across all government institutions. But there are some opportunities at private universities. There are a lot of opportunities for studying English, both for students and faculty, and there are opportunities for collaboration for faculty in terms of research or projects at institutions of higher education in Uganda. So it's a sort of mix there of both opportunities, and a pretty permissive legal environment for settling, but also real lax in terms of finding employment for the most part. In the rest of East Africa and the Gulf, the caveat here, neither of these are areas that we did field research. In Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, from those we spoke to, have conditions similar to Uganda, though travel there is less direct for the most part. And there are some private universities there, but Sudanese academics and students tend to have less networks there and are hindered at times by a need for English and other languages that they don't necessarily have. In Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and the rest of the Gulf in general, Sudanese academics and students have more existing connections, but the legal landscape for visas and residencies shifts pretty frequently. Oman froze the ability of all Sudanese to apply for visas entirely recently. Like there are real variations in their ability to stay or come has been very challenging. Opportunities there have been limited. Most who've moved not through employment, but through familial connections that are pre-existing connections prior to the war, which means that like it's a case of moving and then trying to find work afterwards, which creates its own challenges. There are opportunities for students, but again, these opportunities often require funds that they or their families may not have, which means we've seen a plethora of like GoFundMes for academic opportunities in the Gulf. Now, we give a whole set of recommendations, both to Sudanese institutions and then international institutions, NGOs, and academic institutions. And we talk about Sudanese institutions needing to coordinate regionally to facilitate employment for Sudanese academics and support Sudanese students, also thinking about documentation and degrees and the testing sites for exams and a number of things. For IGOs and NGOs and academic institutions, we sort of divide our recommendations in terms of ways to support Sudanese institutions of higher ed inside of Sudan, at the same time as supporting materially opportunities for both faculty and students outside of Sudan, both of which are really important ingredients. And tailoring this a bit for those in this discussion, some of the ideas of ways to do that for academic institutions involve opportunities for emergency grants. Many academics lost their laptops, which is, in fact, most that I spoke to did lose their laptops because they had to leave their homes in insecure moments, which meant that they didn't bring them for safety reasons, or they had it stolen from them, or in some cases they had to sell them for money when they made it somewhere else. So even relatively small amount of money or like material like laptops could make a big difference for academics displaced. Other questions involve logistics for online teaching for universities outside of Khartoum and like who have less technical expertise and such. For remote teaching, assistance for students and faculty with visa applications and with embassies, and creating systems to allow for those sort of entries whenever possible, and general sort of material support for opportunities in neighboring countries with alongside colleagues and students at universities regionally near Sudan. And so that's sort of the report. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to having this conversation.
Shukran, Rebecca. I think that was an excellent, and please convey our gratitude to Elgadal as well. I think this is really quite an exhaustive listing. I just wanted to give you the figures in terms of the displacement. I think so far, and these are very conservative figures, those are like official UN figures. There's 11 million plus IDPs, internally displaced. Mind you, though, some of those people have been displaced several times, and also in some places, this displacement is not easy to kind of track. The number of refugees is estimated at around 3 million, 1 million formally recognized. But also, again, the numbers could be misleading in this case because there is a lot of illegal entries or informal entries, if you can call it that way. So the magnitude of the problem is quite huge, and we all know that Sudan has a young population. So among those several millions, there's a lot of students and academics and all of that. The other thing is that I think one aggravating factor, in addition to the changing rules of visas, now I think everywhere is closed except South Sudan, perhaps, is that we shouldn't forget the fact that actually people now are exhausting most of their resources. So the situation is being compounded in so many different ways. So let's move to the questions, and I'll have one of my own at some point. We have a question from a colleague that I worked with at Georgetown. I think the last time we spoke about Sudan, Ismail Kushkush. He's a journalist. He's a fairly well-renowned journalist. Kushkush is asking if you have been able to estimate the number of universities and libraries destroyed by the war. I think that's I'm quite saddened by the MOB's center destruction, and that hits home for me because I worked with the later MOB at the Human Rights Organization, and I think there's a lot of miserable kind of depictions of that. That's the first question. The second question came from Kaveh Khoshnood. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. The question is asking, I think, about something that in the mind of a lot of us. How can US and European academic institutions support Sudanese students who lost access to their education? And my question is, have you come across of any Sudanese academic networks of people trying in the diaspora to kind of have a form of a network where a lot of us Sudanese who wanted to help can do, and also Sudanese friends of Sudanese and people who are willing to kind of chip in, they can do that. So let's start with those three questions, and then let's see what comes in later on. Rebecca?
Well, first of all, thank you for these questions. And Ismail, hi, it's really nice you're here. He's in addition to being a world-renowned journalist and excellent, is a dear friend, and so it's nice to see him. So I don't have an estimate on the number destroyed by the war, but I would estimate that, I mean, not all the universities in Khartoum have been destroyed. We won't know the full extent of damage until the conflict stops being in the capital. But given that the majority I mean, easily half of universities, if not more, were located in Khartoum, the stakes are assessing is very difficult right now. For instance, I know, like, you know, University of Khartoum was near the conflict area, but hasn't been looted, and by all accounts seems to be fairly stable and okay right now, except for inaccessible. Meanwhile, Nilain was much closer to a conflict area and a site of combat, and we know that soldiers were around, so it seems likely there was more looting there, but we don't know for sure, you know? I mean, there's a lot of estimates. Meanwhile, like Umdurman Islamia, which was in Umdurman, is a little bit further out, and they were not it's less likely. They were able to secure servers, for instance. They were able to secure more. We know what happened in Ahliya University with the burning of the Muhammad Omar Bashir Center. We just won't know for a while, which is why, like, this research really focused on the human networks and the institutions as people and activity, because the physical infrastructure itself is an uncertainty. And I think, like, the scale of the loss we know will be bad. Exactly how much it will be is indeterminate still. And some of that will get worse over time as this war drags on. How can those in the US and Europe support students? I mean, there's a number of ways. I mean, there's been a big focus on scholarships in America and Europe to the extent there's a focus anywhere, but I actually think that's a mistake. It's cheaper and easier to arrange for scholarships and funding for students in neighboring countries where they're already located. And I see that as being particularly valuable, involving associations with existing institutional connections in Egypt, where the sort of infrastructure right now is very hostile to student enrollment. I think if, MESA was doing lobbying work with institutions they have existing connections with to try and to influence the Egyptian government to at least lower some of the barriers for students and student enrollment, reducing some of the fees that they need to pay, and then arranging for some scholarships, it could make a world of difference for a number of students who've been displaced there and are facing real challenges. In Uganda, the UNHCR subsidizes the university fees for those with a refugee card, which is fairly easy to get for Sudanese citizens right now. But there are logistical barriers, and that's where the Ministry of Higher Education will need to do things. But I think that some of these efforts focusing on ways of supporting students as they register in regionally keeps them closer to their families and to networks of care. I also think that focusing on ways of supporting Sudanese universities who have external testing sites in Egypt and Saudi, helping them create a testing site in Uganda so that students can get to somewhere that it's less difficult to find a visa if they're displaced elsewhere. Thinking about ways to support with remote education, providing funds for like some of that and providing logistical support and technical support for that can make a world of difference for some of the state universities as well. And have I come across networks in diaspora who want to help and have found ways to do so? I mean, to some extent, but often at the low level. So for instance, University of Khartoum graduates have raised money to fund the accommodation for students going to testing sites for their exams. And it would be great to see that sort of initiatives in diaspora for other universities that don't have as strong of an alumni network. Those students from Darfur, Kordofan don't necessarily have a strong alumni network for, University of East Kordofan, say, but these students may well need the funds to go and take their exams as well, and logistical support for that. There are institutions like the Sudanese Association of American Association of Sudanese Professors, which I'm not sure what they've been doing, but I know they've been thinking of ways to do so, and they might be a great venue in America to think about sort of creative programming. But a lot of this comes down to money and a need to fundraise. We know in American discourse about the need for solidarity and support for Gaza, and that's definitely important, and these are not competing things. But the scale of the need in Sudan is also great. And this is directly an area where we can express and act out in solidarity with our colleagues and caring for our colleagues as students in a way that's really meaningful and important, and where the funds will be very much needed. So that's sort of my thoughts on these questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. There is a good kind of retort from Kaveh Khoshnood. She noted that in order to ascertain the damage caused to universities, that's something similar to what she's doing at TL, Humanitarian Research Lab. They're mapping out actually the destruction of hospitals, or the attack on hospitals. I'm assuming they use GIS and all that kind of satellite imagery and things like that. So I think that's a really excellent idea. And she's been, Kaveh, I don't know the gender, but they have gratefully submitted the report and the link for the report. So I'm hoping that we can caption it and put it for all the participants to look at. I think that's an excellent idea. That will help a lot in terms of mapping out the destruction, or at least knowing the magnitude. So that's the report has been posted. For those of you who are interested, you can download it. For the participants, some of the questions that have been answered already, so I'm going to kind of focus on the parts that have not been answered. We have a young participant, Sudanese University student, Yusuf Abubakar. He's asking actually if you have any ideas of how he can engage in advocating for Sudanese academics and universities. And then he has a question that is more directed to Lara and asking how can the Near and Eastern, not just Lara, FIDA as well, Near and Eastern and African departments can call attention to the destruction of academia in Sudan. I think Yusuf, this event is part of that kind of response, but I think I know the leaders of both institutions. They have been extremely keen on drawing the attention to Sudan, and so I think that is something that I think it could happen. Another question we have from Alice Kukaba. She's asking a very good question. She's asking you to shed light on the gendered impacts of the destruction. So not only women universities are destroyed, but I think Sudan, at least half of the student population were women, if not more than that. So I think the gender element is quite significant. I'm just going to add the last question. There is also Omnia Shaukat. Her question is the difficult one, which is the impact of this destruction on the potential for peace and development in post-conflict Sudan. I think those are also very significant questions. So back to you, Rebecca, and then we can take another round.
Well, thank you for all these questions. I think they're all really important. So how for Sudanese students abroad to advocate for Sudanese academia and Sudanese, I mean, honestly, so much of this is about fundraising, and I think that some of it is fundraising drives. I mean, ultimately, students need to see what cause or what part of it seems manageable to them for their fundraising. But one thing I think might be a good way to frame it I would love to see if there was something with some sort of direct solidarity with students of like, students are going to be taking exams, universities and are going to need funds to deal for accommodation for all these things for students who have the travel itself to get to the exams in a way that like that might be a direct moment of like we should be like solidarity with our colleagues who are also university students in Sudan right now. That seems like a very like intuitive place where perhaps students might be really well placed to think about in terms of fundraising. Another way is by pressuring and asking your institutions what they are doing on Sudan. I mean, I know that there is interest in leadership, but there's so many crises in this world that we're dealing with. And I mean, I know in America, even just it feels like a bombardment of bad news. And I think drawing attention to the fact that no, right now, this is how it's not just sort of a series of violence without any logic to it. In the midst of this, people are working to keep institutions alive. People are working to create opportunities for their students, for their colleagues, both inside of Sudan and outside, and thinking of and like that, and asking what sort of things and what sort of opportunities are being granted at your institution of higher ed makes a big difference, because I think it's not like anyone's hostile to the idea, but if it doesn't come up, then it will be forgotten and the attention will be on other pressing concerns. So in that sense, I think that students and faculty need to raise the question over and over again, not just once, not just in one meeting, but in every meeting. And it can feel repetitive to do that, but I think that's really important work politically and like for thinking about ways to help continue these institutions. Now, with regards to sort of the gendered impacts, I'm really happy that someone asked this because I didn't talk about it because of the time, but there are serious ones. Over half of students were women prior to the war, women and girls. I mean, they're very young students sometimes at university in Sudan. I had a student at one point who was 16. So yeah, but also faculty were roughly equal men and women as well. It was a very well represented women with higher degrees in Sudan prior to the outbreak of war. And the war has had different effects for both female students and female academics and lecturers. Generally speaking, female academics have faced a sort of double set of questions, while male lecturers and academics tended to go where an opportunity is and sort of in discussion with their family, but with the logic of where their work is. There is a different set. Women have tended to follow their husbands, often, especially if neither had an opportunity, but even when there's an opportunity for a woman, when there isn't for her husband, it can create its own set of problems and create its own set of issues. Now, for instance, opportunities for work in South Sudan have largely gone to male lecturers. That's not because women aren't interested. And I should say that there were about 10 or less of the 100 plus that I heard of that were women of those who were hired at University of Juba. So there were some women, but the reason that they largely did not go was sort of threefold. Part of it was the question of accommodation. Getting secure accommodation that can also accommodate your family is very expensive in Juba, which meant that if you have children, especially there's a reluctance to bring them there, both for stability concerns or safety concerns, but also expense. Similarly, like the accommodation that is found isn't always easy. I mean, some accounts of challenges, even if like you don't have children, if you're married, and like how it will be for you and your spouse for finding accommodation makes it very difficult, much less with the expenses and your spouse not having a job. Similarly, there are questions of travel safety. So for both female academics, but especially female students, one of the questions is access to testing sites. Travel in Sudan right now is extremely dangerous. There are lots of accounts of violence on the road, and that means and women are at risk for gender-based violence in the midst of this conflict, which means that families, when they are thinking about asking their daughters to travel to take exams, there's a whole set of risks that they're dealing with, as well as great expenses for the family, where for accommodation and secure accommodation when they reach a testing site, that a family might be more comfortable with their son dealing or like living a little bit rougher than they would with their daughter, which means that as a result, this war affects female students by making it even harder and more expensive for families to get their daughters to continue in their education and get their exams than in that sense. So, I mean, those are the two biggest gendered dynamics that I see coming out of this conflict for both academics and students. Now, with regards to the impact on a post-conflict Sudan, it really depends how long this war lasts. Right now, if the war were to end tomorrow, it would be still disastrous for Sudan and for every institution in Sudan, realistically. However, there would be a method to restart secondary schools. There would be a method to start rebuilding, to bring people back, to start the process of restarting these institutions. But what keeps me up at night right now about this is what's going to happen if this war persists another 2 years, another 5 years, in the sense that, like, I mean, right now, the Sudanese government is holding the first secondary school national exams since the outbreak of war. And in some way, this is a logistical nightmare. It's extremely difficult. And those who will be able to take this exam are going to be in very inequitable situations with very limited access to testing sites if you're from the wrong place. For so many, it's a hard, impossible situation. But in many ways, while it is extremely difficult, this is the easiest year, because the students who are taking these exams were close to graduating before the war broke out, which means they completed most of their studying. They're going to not score very well. They're facing traumas. They're facing deep problems, but they at least got access to that education beforehand for the most part. In 2 years' time, however, that's not going to be the case. The students from a cohort that were starting secondary school but hadn't even really begun before the war, when estimates from UNICEF are that 90% of school-age children in Sudan are out of school right now, we're talking about a system where even those who might be able to take the exam, like whether they get the studying in to take the exam or to be able to reflect it anything on that exam in a few years will be uncertain. And that's where, the sort of feeders into higher ed is going to be a generation, if this war persists, who've been cut off from opportunities for basics, primary and secondary education. So that's a grim ways to end my comments, but that's what scares me.
Can I jump in really quickly, since you pointed to me, Professor Al-Obeid? Thank you so much, Rebecca, for all of this and keeping us. I want to really echo, but also appreciate this this point that it's not about saying there are other conflicts and none of them are in competition, or that we can sort of say, I mean, we do. This is why we sort of wanted to have this speaker series we called Keep Eyes on Sudan. And it's a series of talks. I've put it in the chat. We're already planning for the spring to continue these conversations on different themes. We have a talk already planned for January that we hope many of you can join us for. It will have a virtual component as well. That will focus on a different aspect, but we've had a series of talks in the fall, and we will continue this. On that page, we also have a list of a number of organizations, and if Rebecca, you have any, or Professor Al-Obeid, if either of you have any specifically focused on higher education that we've not included, that we should include, we have both Sudanese-led organizations as well as international NGOs working in Sudan. And we encourage everybody on this call to select those carefully, because I think Rebecca's point is a really important one, to sort of think about ways that one might give, because really funds are so important, but also to give in ways that that might help us to raise consciousness amongst groups of people that can act in specific ways of solidarity. And so for us at Georgetown and in our particular centers and programs, we really wanted to, as African Studies and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies started to build this out, we reached out to partner organizations that we really saw here at the university that had intersecting mandates educationally and from a research perspective that we knew would be interested in working with us on this, to reach out to those communities. And we've continued to build it out. And so for this talk, for example, we're just so delighted that the African Studies Association and the Middle East Studies Association could be part of it with us, because we see that its members really also have so much in conversation with this research on higher education institutions. So that's, we agree, important. We'll continue it so long as we need to. We would like for that to be shorter rather than longer, but if we need it to be longer, then we will and we should.
Thank you, Lara. I think that's very important, and I draw the attention to the link you just posted on the chat for the Keeping Eyes on Sudan series at Georgetown. I think it's an excellent idea to put it there. I don't think I have more questions on the chat, and so I think I just want to stop at the whether the war stops tomorrow or persists. The Sudanese part of me wanted to stop yesterday, but I did a lot of work in Yemen. And one of my persistent nightmares is actually, I can't help but compare the two conflicts. And I think Yemen is another sad case where it has been forgotten long time ago, even though the war has been going for now almost 10 years. And the destruction of education and health facilities has been enormous. And I think at the start, people thought this could be brought to an end very quickly, but it persisted. So I think a lot of us are praising for something similar in Sudan. So the question becomes, if that is the case, what are we going to do, especially with a lot of young people who sacrificed an awful lot, who sacrificed in 2019 and before to bring the change that was kind of stolen by the two warring parties, but the two sets of war criminals, if you wish. So in that sense, but I really believe in the resilience of the young people of the country. I mean, they've done some miraculous things in 2019, and I think they can do a lot more in that sense. So I don't know, Lara, if we stop here or we see if
I
there's any. I don't see any more
I
questions in
think
that
that's,
sense.
yeah, I agree. That's great. And I think we all probably really appreciate that perspective. So thank you, Elgadal. And
Excellent.
thank you, Rebecca, for
Yeah.
such a
Once
thorough,
again,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry.
No,
Once
go
again,
ahead.
Rebecca, yeah, thank you very much. And please convey the same thing to Mona
Mhm,
Elgadal. We're really appreciative of both of your efforts. And
mhm,
I think we have a lot to kind of think about and to keep an eye on this thing. I know I personally, when I come back, I'm gonna nag Lara and
mhm,
Fida for more stuff to do,
mhm,
or at least I'm gonna try to do my own as well.
mhm.
And and thank everybody for attending. And once again, we'll see you in another event on Sudan, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
all
everybody.
very much for organizing this, and thank you all who attended.